Of what will become a weekly live streamed broadcast every Tuesday called Fifth Estate Live. The Fifth Estate is an anarchist publication that has existed in one form or another since 1965. Longtime Detroit area radio talk show host Peter Werby is a founding editor of the Fifth Estate, and he's the producer for this show, and I'm the host. As with the Monday open mic and discussions with David on Wednesday through Friday, Fifth Estate Live is being broadcast on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cebu Community Radio, the Song News Network, as well as my own Facebook page and my channels on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, VK, and LinkedIn. Broadcasts pretty much always begin at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. You can find all of them in podcast form soon after they're over if you look for This Week with David Rovics on any of the usual podcasting platforms, or go to davidrovics.com. Our first guest on Fifth Estate Live is a regular contributor to the Fifth Estate, an author of many books that you can find in PM Press's catalog, including his most recent collection of essays, Between Earth and Empire, From the Necrocene to the Beloved Community. You'll also find some of his most recent notes on the current situation if you look for John Clark's blog on pmpress.org. John is a professor emeritus at Loyola University, where he taught for many years. He's a 12th generation New Orleanian and the coordinator of La Terre Institute for Community and Ecology, a project he's been involved with for decades on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. John P. Clark, welcome to Fifth Estate Live.
Thank you so much, David.
You know, it's hard to know where to start, but the pandemic, the response to it by the U.S. government, and the fallout from all of that are laying bare so many of the deep problems in this society, kind of illustrating so many of the points you've been making in your writing for so many years. And I wonder if you could just start by talking about the situation in New Orleans right now.
The situation in New Orleans is a long-term situation. You know, it's a city of disasters. It's a city of plague and pestilence and flooding and hurricanes and destruction and death and suffering, in addition to being a city of joy and music and celebration, and I would say even the radical imagination. You know, I have hopes for it to be one of the key foci of the rebirth of the radical imagination. In a sense, we were prepared for this disaster by living through disaster many times, but especially in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. And even though I'd been developing ideas about mutual aid and anti-authoritarianism and communitarianism and liberation for decades, Hurricane Katrina was really a turning point in my life. I was in India, and I really would like to preface it with this, because this is where many of my ideas about mutual aid really developed a lot just a few, 15 years ago.
From a trip to India?
I was in India setting up a summer program that has been going for the last 15 years, and Hurricane Katrina hit. And I remember sitting up on the roof of a Tibetan guest house where we were staying, where there was a little restaurant, and looking at the BBC, watching the destruction, and thinking, who is it who will be where they are needed? Who will come to New Orleans in the midst of devastation and destruction and do the kind of caring work that's needed? I thought, well, will it be the left in general? Are people I could work with from the left? Will it be, I'd been friendly with Quakers, the Catholic left at Loyola, the Green Movement. I was very active in the Green Movement. I thought, well, could it be the anarchists? And I thought, well, probably not, but I hope so. But when I came back, I found really tens of thousands of people who had come to New Orleans with a kind of anarchist inspiration. The Common Ground Collective was the big influence in that area. And I ended up working with a lot of those people. I worked with a small group where we all live together 24 hours a day, work together, put everything into the recovery. And this was really my first experience of living in a recovery community, which later I started calling a community of liberation and solidarity, a community dedicated to the liberation of the community, but also in solidarity with the community and all the needs of the community. And at that point, I decided that that was the type of life I wanted to live. I wanted to be in that kind of community. So I wrote this book called The Impossible Community, and it was very much inspired by that experience. And when our current crisis emerged, I had many of the same thoughts. Who will come? What can we do? And of course, not only who will come, but who is here who can do the work that is needed. So as you know, I wrote an article on mutual aid in New Orleans, which appeared on my PM Press blog recently.
And you used the term disaster anarchism, which was, makes sense to use the term, especially in the wake of the popularity of Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, where she talks about disaster capitalism. But what is disaster anarchism?
Well, disaster anarchism is exactly what I learned about, what I had read about, of course, before that. But what I learned about through that experience, it's in a certain sense, it's the practice of unconditional love for the community and for other human beings and for the natural world. I mean, in a sense, that's what it is. It's also based on a certain concept of freedom, which is freedom not as freedom from, not as the kind of freedom that we're seeing proclaimed now, that I don't want to take care of the community. I don't want to protect the community. I want my freedom to do whatever I feel like doing at this moment. It's not that kind of negative, destructive, pseudo-freedom, but the freedom that comes from being part of the community, contributing to the community, caring for the community, and being part of the collective self-realization of the community.
One of the things that keeps coming up for me, and I've noticed that you've written about it quite a lot in a lot of different contexts, but is this whole question of imagining how the world and the society could be different, and how vital it is to be able to imagine how things could be different. Because as what was the slogan that was popular in France in '68 was, if you can't imagine how the world could be different, then how could you what was it?
Well, there are a number. I mean, the big slogan was imagination, pouvoir, power to the imagination.
Right.
And that kind of covered it all. Although
and free the imagination. Another is like a sort of as if it's a political prisoner, in a sense.
Well, I have questions about that slogan, because in a certain sense, the imagination is always in power. The question is, which imagination?
Which imagination, right? I don't know if you've seen the book Fantasyland, but I thought that some of the conclusions were a little weird, but the basis of the research was fascinating about the whole history of the U.S. as basically a sort of religious con artist fantasy, and the dominance of fantasy in the sort of governance of the whole society for so long, like the creation of what they called the new American, or the new man. I think they called the American a new kind of person, not like the old European somehow, like whatever they meant by that, But yeah.
Well, these are all, there's something it's called the social imaginary, and it's one of the most powerful forces. And one of the things that I've tried to develop in several of those books is the question of how does the system of social determination work? Why do we have the world that we have? And why do we have a certain difficulty in creating a different kind of world? And I focused on 4 spheres of determination, some of which the traditional left and social change people focus on, such as the social ideology. You hear a lot about the social ideology. You also hear a lot about social institutions. Not that we've necessarily done an adequate job of coming to grips with these, but what you don't hear enough about is the social ethos. That is, how do we live our lives from moment to moment? This is the real question of social praxis or social practice. And the fourth sphere is the social imagination. We are products of the institutional structure, but we're not just puppets of the institutional structure. We also have a lot going on within our mind and our spirit. And these are largely the products of the ideology, the imaginary, and ethos. I mean, the dominant system is not only out there as an institutional structure, it's also in our minds, in our imaginations, and in our very bodies, because of the habits and practices that we participate in. So this is really the challenge that we face. How can we recreate all of these, and have a liberated community?
And this has been also one of the projects that you've been very much engaged in for decades now. Also, is this actual community that you call La Terre, and I wonder if you talk about a lot of people in my travels, you see there's a lot of people who are doing a lot of thinking, and other people doing a lot of organizing, and other people sort of modeling of how they would like society to be, but they're not necessarily the same people doing those things, if you know what I mean. And you're kind of involved in all of those spheres. And
I think you're giving me too much credit. I can't claim that. But no, really, I some of those I am involved in, and I do have a community, and my community is New Orleans. Actually, we have 12 generations here, but that includes my grandchildren. So I'm only 10th generation, but I am very much rooted in New Orleans. I'm very much rooted in the neighborhoods, in the culture, in the traditions, and I hope in the aspirations of the city. La Terre Institute is much more of an educational institution, a place for workshops, for courses, for reflection. Although it's also a place for practice, which is practice of being in the woods, practice and being we're always in nature. We can't get out of that. We're always in the natural world. I think we have to remember that. And one of the book I've always used when people want an introduction to thinking about nature, I always recommend, and I've had courses on Gary Snyder's book, The Practice of the Wild. And one of the things that I love in his work is that he emphasizes that the wild is everywhere, that the wild is in our own mind. He says the poet's mind is wild mind, and we are all poets. It's hard to believe sometimes, but if you spend a little time with any young child, you'll know that human beings are inherently wild-minded and poetic, which is a great source of help. So La Terre Institute is a place where we can have programs, where we can reflect on these things, where we can talk about strategies to create community, where we can spend time in the woods and perhaps discover some striking examples of the wildness of nature that might help us find it everywhere.
When you were, I know I'm skipping around here, but to be honest, I've been reading more of your writing in the past few hours than I've ever read, and my mind is swimming with a lot of the things I've been reading. And you talk about a lot of very thought-provoking stuff, even for somebody who's already thinking about this stuff a lot. But one of the things you've spent some time on researching and writing about is your own family history, and I know you translated 400 pages of material from your own 12 generations in New Orleans, and I just wonder, just talk about that a bit. I imagine I've done a bit of genealogical research myself, and I wonder, how many elephants in the living room and skeletons in the closet did you come across?
Okay, well, I didn't expect this question, but I'm very much involved in that because it's my history and it's the history of my community, and it's really world history, because wherever you go, you find world history. Mm-hmm. The letters that I translated were from the 1830s to the 1870s and focused very strongly on the 1860s and the Civil War period. And there's a whole history there, because there's a narrative, there's a family narrative, which is part of the story of basically the collapse of a society. It was a society that had invested very heavily on in injustice, basically. It had a slave economy. It also had a developing capitalist economy. I've also translated Élisée Reclus, who was in Louisiana in the 1850s and wrote about the brutality of slavery. He was a tutor on a plantation for several years and had firsthand experience of the injustices and oppression of that system. And the economy of the society was built on developing capitalism plus the slave economy of the region. And to me, it's a story that, in a sense, prefigures our story today. It's a story of a society that was committed to a doomed system and did not know how to break with that system, and as a result, destroyed itself. And in a sense, it did destroy itself. The society that existed in the 1850s no longer existed. So I think there's something to learn there. It was certainly the death of the French Creole Society in Louisiana as the dominant kind of culture. It was doomed anyway, but that accelerated the whole process, and the really decline of the South into a backwater of ignorance and prejudice and so forth. And there was another future that was possible at that time, which was rejected. So I got to read about this story from the standpoint, particularly of two women. My great-great-great-grandmother, Marie-Victoire Gosselin was the family name, and her sister, Félonie. And it was very enlightening to see it from their point of view and from the inside. And ultimately, my great-great-great-grandmother became completely disillusioned with the society, condemned it, denounced the politicians for taking them into the war, and she left the country and went back to France, where much of the family lived, and told her children that they should leave the United States, right, because of the evils of the society that they had seen and the destructiveness. So I kind of read that story in relation to our present crisis, which is that we are locked in to an institutional structure, to a system of domination, which is doomed and is going to lead to a collapse far beyond the collapse of old French Creole society in Louisiana. It's going to lead to a global collapse, population crash, collapse of the biosphere, and probably loss of millions of species. We talk a lot about the climate catastrophe, which we should, but we're also in the midst of the sixth great mass extinction of life on Earth. And we have a system that we are fundamentally committed to. We have a social ideology that supports it, a social imaginary that supports it, a practice of everyday life that supports it. And we're having a lot of trouble breaking with that. We very easily fall for illusions of change, of making gestures that will lead us out of this deadlock. But we have yet to find the solution that we need. One of the things that I write about a lot is the problem of not only denial, but disavowal. Denial is the psychological, defense mechanism in which I will not believe the truth. Disavowal is the the defense mechanism in which I believe the truth, but I act as if I don't know the truth. And that's what we're facing. That's what the political system is locked in. That's what the economic system is locked in. That's what most of reform and social change movements are locked into.
It's, you know, people often say when they're looking at history, people will often say, well, so and so was a product of their time, and they didn't really understand what was going on, like whether they're talking about genocide or slavery or being a robber baron or stealing land from people or whatever it is, you know, they're talking about. But it's I wonder. I mean, it seems like you could apply the same thinking to the current moment. And people, I'm sure, in 20, 30 years, well, I know they'll be saying the same thing that we're now saying, that you hear people say all the time on National Public Radio and other corporate news outlets, where they talk about how, like, oh, well, back in 2003, people just didn't understand that Iraq really did not possess weapons of mass destruction, all this kind of stuff, as if it wasn't already known at the time what was going on. That you know, just taking that as a random example, that the U.S. was about to go into a war that was based on a list of 31 false pretenses, right?
Right.
But I wonder if that just reflect on that concept.
Well, that's a hugely important question that you're posing, and I think there's a lot to learn from that situation, because it's seldom true that nobody knew.
Right.
You know, some know.
And your great-grandmother knew, for example.
Well, in fact, my great-great-great-aunt knew even more. She wrote in one of the letters that slavery was the greatest scourge on humanity.
And she was living through it at the time.
Me, because she was a woman in an era in which women were not listened to, in which, I mean, when Reclus wrote about that period, he said everybody was afraid to even say anything about the system, that the economic system, the political system, the religion, everything was unified in defending the system, and people were silenced. But I mean, I read the letters, and she knew, not that she knew what to do. She had no idea what to do, but she knew that it was the greatest injustice in human history, which amazes me in a sense that she had that level of consciousness. And she also knew that her family was benefiting from that system, and they were among the elite. But she didn't know what to do with that either.
Yeah.
But I think what we have to learn from the situation that you described is that at every point in history, there are people who do know and do see. And there are many people who do not know and do not see. And we have to learn how to interpret the evidence. We have to learn how to be part of the group that can see and who can know. You know, I mean, Reclus obviously I was writing about this anarchist geographer who saw many, many things that other people did not see. At the same time that most of the working class movement was focused on factories and the system of production, which he was very active in the First International. He was also a radical feminist. And for instance, he defended oppressed women who killed their husbands. And he said they should not be prosecuted because they were rebelling against despotism. That was a very radical position to take in the mid-19th century. He also saw that there was an ecological crisis, and that the ecological question was at the center of the political question. He also saw that racism was quite central to the system of domination globally. And he was a lifelong first anti-slavery and then anti-racism activist. He was also an animal rights activist and an ethical vegetarian and so forth. And you don't find a lot of people in the mid-19th century who were radical feminists, radical ecologists, revolutionary labor organizers, etc. But there were some. We have to learn who to listen to. And of course, there's this tremendous pressure, including when you become part of even a leftist movement. Movements on the left, in many ways, are very oppressive. because they give you often, this is, I think, one reason why, anarchism appeals to me, that it has a certain critique of all forms of domination. And we have to be careful that we're not focusing on one or two that perhaps are closer to our hearts at the moment, or even throughout our lives, and neglecting the other forms of domination, the other forms of oppression.
It's very clear, isn't it, that this becomes such a big problem? I mean, you can see in practice how often that becomes such a problem when people are only focusing on, say, climate change, and as important as that is, it's oftentimes, it seems to then develop into oftentimes a very white middle class kind of movement that tends not to be taking other things into account. Just taking one random example, but it's
or it doesn't
so true,
necessarily become that, but that's all you hear about.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you know the world, if you know what's going on in the world, you know that peasants and small farmers and indigenous people all over the world have been involved in ecological struggles long before what they were doing was identified as part of the movement. And of course, I've always hated the term environmental movement, because the environment is something that's around us.
Because what do you call, for example, like those people that you write about in Papua New Guinea who are opposing the one of the biggest and most destructive mines in the world, and nobody's going to call them environmental activists, but that's certainly what they are, among many other things.
Yeah, that's West Papua, which is part of Indonesia. And I basically spent the 90s working with the Papuans. And before Hurricane Katrina, I think that was one of the other transformative experiences. It was a 10-year experience. But I started getting involved in the movement when the same corporation decided to dump enormous quantities of radioactive gypsum waste in the Mississippi River, and endangering that ecosystem and also the water supply for many, many people.
Did they do that? Or was that prevented?
Yeah, they were not allowed to do it. They were not allowed to do it. The CEO of the corporation, who really seemed like a fictional character, he was the ultimate example of cowboy capitalism and just this kind of insanity. He said that Louisiana was a banana republic. He may have been right, but he thought the reason why Louisiana was a banana republic is because they would not allow him to dump, millions of tons of radioactive waste into the Mississippi River. In other words, Louisiana was standing in the way of industry and progress. But I won't go. I mean, it's an amazing story. I could tell you some really good anecdotes about this guy, but I wrote about them. A few of them are in the book. But as a result of fighting against this, I found out that much worse things were going on in West Papua, that basically ecocide and cultural genocide were going on, and that the United States government, Freeport-McMoran Corporation, RTZ, Rio Tinto, the largest mining corporation, and so forth, were allies of the Suharto dictatorship and were involved in some of the worst atrocities going on in the world. So basically through the 90s, above all because the corporation was trying to endow an environmental chair at my university, and I fought against that, and at other universities, I got involved in this, and the Papuan people became my greatest teachers. They transformed my ideas about the world, about human society. Not that I didn't have any of the ideas that developed, but they gave me such depth of experience and concrete evidence of what was going on that this was a really transformative experience. So one of the things I've been interested in, particularly for the last 30 years, is what we can learn from indigenous values. What we can learn from societies that still believe that the community is central to our lives, that still believe in a sense, they do believe in a kind of unconditional love, at least an unconditional giving. They still have remnants of the gift economy, which is what Western radicalism has looked to as something we could create in the future. They've called it things like communism or socialism, something like that. But in a certain sense, it's what we already had.
so many of these ideas of Western radicalism have been around in so many parts of the world for such a long time, and they're sort of attributed to somebody from the 1840s, which was quite a decade for coming up with new ideas. But it was, like one of the things I don't want to be too jagged about switching the subject here, but you also talk a lot about Taoism, and I've been fascinated with Taoism since I was a little kid, and I was as a teenager first reading about dialectics. I thought, well, this is all Taoism. Like, what's new here? Yeah. And but I wonder if one of the things I often talk about with anybody who when I'm about just how it feels like in the United States, we live in, especially if you ever turn on the television, we live in like a big mind control experiment. If you've gone to school, if you turn on the TV, if you turn on the radio, it's like, you feel like a mushroom in a closet. But if you leave the country and just go just about anywhere else, even if it's not some kind of amazing society where they've got everything figured out, it's still, you can still get so much out of the experience, and because other societies are not like this one, even like in Europe
either.
Right, like Canada.
One of the things we are doing at La Terre Institute, Bayou La Terre, is that there's an indigenous group that's used. I have 88 acres out there, and part of the land has been turned over to an indigenous group, which does sweat lodge ceremonies and other traditional practices on the land. So, I mean, in a certain sense, I only have to walk, a few hundred feet to be in touch with people who are trying to propagate the traditional values that I think are so profoundly important to us today. And there are people all over. I mean, if you've been active, I was active in the Bayou Bridge pipeline struggle, and indigenous people were really the leaders here of that struggle. And I think many people learned about those values, and we have to remember that indigenous people are still around on this continent, and you don't have to go that far to talk to them and work with them and support their struggles. And one of the things that I think we can learn from many traditions that some of us are part of, but one of the things we can learn from indigenous traditions is that indigenous people have had to face death so often and so profoundly. And I don't think most movements take death seriously. They don't take birth seriously either. Those are two of the things I've been thinking a lot about. There's a famous German philosopher who in many ways was a really awful person. His name was Heidegger, and he talked about this concept of being toward death, which I think is very important. We have to take death seriously, particularly if we are in a new era. Some people like to use our name, Anthropocene, to label it. I don't think it deserves our name.
Now you call it the Necrocene, which
the Necrocene. I think I called it the Thanatocene for a while. I changed to the Necrocene.
Thanatocene, yeah.
Thanatocene. Right. Yeah. It's the new era of death on Earth. It's the era of mass extinction. That's what the fossil record is going to show. And I think we have to take death seriously. I mean, one thing that I think a lot about is all these people who in their private lives think it's so important to be a good parent and grandparent. They're basically condemning their great-grandchildren to miserable, awful deaths by supporting the dominant system. I think everybody needs to think of that death that their own descendants, or if they don't have any, the descendants of everybody they know, will be going through.
It seems like we're in a moment in time in this country and many other places where there's a lot more thinking about these things going on than there has been in quite a while because of the circumstances of the pandemic. I don't know, I don't know what is going to be the way necessarily to drive things forward in good directions, but it seems whatever that may be, we're clearly at a precipice right here. Yeah,
we will be it if it happens. We have to be it. That's in a sense, it's a huge burden to think we have to be it. But I mean, that's basically the story. But what I wanted to mention is about not only being toward death, but also being toward life is so important. And we're not really thinking enough about our own lives, about the lives of others, and life on Earth. Now, I think one thing about the pandemic is that maybe it's shaking us a little and getting us to think a bit about life and death. So that's one time. I won't go into that much, but I thought I should mention it. But the third that I really think is so important is being toward life. And this is one of the things that changed when indigenous society was conquered. And basically the matricentric, matrifocal, matrilineal societies were overthrown. And patriarchy was established because in those other societies, birth was very important. And the rituals were largely about birth and rebirth. And this is where ethos comes in the social imaginary. I mean, can we live in a culture in which life and death and birth are at the center of our whole being and our whole social practice? I mean, can we put this into effect right now? Can we start doing it? And one of the things I love about indigenous groups is that they're already doing it. We can see it. Now we can also go to Chiapas, and a friend of mine, Dylan Fitzwater, he wasn't a friend until I found out about his book when it was a thesis he wrote called Autonomy is in Our Hearts. And it's about the Tzotzil language in Chiapas. And it's about how indigenous values basically converted the Zapatista militants from being Marxist-Leninists, vanguardists, into being people who would serve the people and follow the people, leading by serving, leading by following. And it was indigenous values that transformed them and allowed them to help create one of the really great examples we have in this world right now. I think Rojava is another one. I think the indigenous people in Bolivia and the El Alto community and other places are also examples, but Chiapas is certainly one. And there's just a miracle there that these people who were supposed to be programmed to be militants and vanguardists opened themselves up to transformation. They opened themselves up to life and birth and to the community.
And it really went along a somewhat similar trajectory in terms of the evolution of the PKK in Rojava area. I mean, that with the ideas about horizontal organizing that they have applied so effectively. And talk about Rojava a little bit, because this is also very controversial.
Case. Yeah, it's an amazing case. And of course, one of the wonderful things about it is that through Öcalan's studies, he did actually become part of the great tradition of the Spanish Revolution, of the communalization in Aragon, and this whole history of the commune. Right now, by the way, PM Press asked me to do a blurb for the new edition of Kropotkin's Words of a Rebel and his great French Revolution. One of the great things in Kropotkin is, and also in Reclus, they carried on this history of the 11th and 12th century medieval commune, the free city, which ultimately goes back to indigenous traditions. There's a whole history there. And so Rojava inherited that. And that almost miraculously, this was combined with radical feminism. And, that Öcalan developed this radical critique of patriarchy in which he says the most important thing is to kill the dominant male and kill the patriarch. And so it's again like a kind of miracle. So we have so much to learn from these historical cases in Rojava, several million people. In Chiapas, at least tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of people have been influenced. And in indigenous movements around the world, certainly millions of people are involved in things that we can learn from.
John, one of the things we were, before we got on the air live, we were talking about how we both watched Democracy Now! Yesterday and heard Noam Chomsky's perspective on the current moment, and you had some analysis of that I think would be of great interest to
Right.
But maybe you could just recap what he talked about too, because I don't know if I'm guessing about half the people watching probably also saw Democracy Now! Yesterday, but the other half might not have.
Well, speaking of miracles, I mean, Noam Chomsky is a miracle. I admire his mind tremendously, as I'm sure everyone does, and I'm always amazed at what he does. He talked about three things, and two of them I really agree with him on. One I have a lot of differences on. I won't talk about it much, but he talked about the importance of voting for Biden. And, I truly hope that Trump is defeated, but I have a lot of differences on that issue. And I don't plan to vote for Biden, but I'll certainly tell anybody who wants to participate in the duopoly that be sure that you don't vote for Trump. But the second topic he talked about is the Trump and the Republican Party. Basically, that Trump is the most dangerous figure in the history of the world. I mean, I think that's what he's getting at, and I think with the power that he has and the level of psychosis that he exhibits, I think he is, in fact, the most dangerous person in the history of the world up to this point. And he talks about the Republican Party as the most dangerous criminal gang in the world. I think the Democratic Party is probably the second most dangerous criminal gang in the world. And I understand why people might want to side with the second most dangerous. But the third thing he talked about was what really interested me, which was the idea of creating a progressive international. And he said that Varoufakis, the Greek former governmental minister and leader of the left in many ways, and Sanders got together and suggested that a progressive international be created. And he gave some, I don't want to misquote him, I do have some notes here. He said he didn't see much hope on the level of states for this international, but he mentioned three things that were hopeful. One is what's come out of the Sanders campaign. Second is what's developing on the grassroots level with self-help groups. And the third is something he called progressive internationalism at the level of states. And he gave the example of Cuban doctors being sent around the world and the Chinese government giving material aid. Well, I don't really think that progressive internationalism on the state level is what we, it's a good thing, but it's not really the international that we need. I don't think the Sanders campaign has really been aimed at a progressive international. But at the time of the Paris Commune, there was a concept called the Universal Republic, which was a very inspiring ideal. And the idea was the Paris Commune and other communes that were developing, which was basically taking over the municipal government and creating other institutions.
What other communes? Sorry, what? There were others at the time going on?
The Commune of Lyon, and there were attempts at communes, but the Paris Commune only lasted less than 2 months. So
in 1871,
it didn't develop very much, but the idea was spreading, and people were trying to create communes. The concept was that this could become global. And at the same time, Élisée Reclus also wrote about this, that the first international, he thought, the International Workers Association, was a turning point in human history, because it was the first time that workers came together, well, not from everywhere in the world, but from many countries. And, the influence spread to Asia and South America and so forth. The idea was basically that the workers of the world could unite and that they could transform the world together. And there was this very inspiring concept of the Universal Republic. The Republic, was a very radical concept at that time. They were still in the process of overthrowing monarchies. That's what a republic was. It was, a public thing, a thing of the people. That's why we have such irony in which, there's a Republican Party that's very anti-Republican. It wants to privatize everything, and it comes from the word a public thing. And then there's a Democratic Party, which is basically an elitist, bureaucratic kind of institution, which is not for grassroots democracy. Of course, this is nothing new, because there were many communist parties that were basically trying to stamp out every form of communalism that existed, particularly in Russia, which had a very highly advanced level, that Kropotkin wrote about this, but even the late Marx was writing about the Russian mir as a possible inspiration for the future. The mir is the collective farm, as a peasant commune, basically, in many ways, as a possible inspiration for the future of socialism. So that was a moment in history in which there were great possibilities. But if we look today, we see internationals. There's an international of capital. I mean, in a certain sense, the United Nations, as much as the right-wing extreme right hates it, it's basically a capitalist international.
I mean, the extreme right hates the New York Times, so you never know.
Right. My friend Joe Cavell unfortunately died a couple of years ago, and my friend Quincy Saul edited his essays, and he put in a little anecdote in his introduction about a conversation I had with Joel, and I hope everybody reads Joel. He wrote a wonderful book called The Enemy of Nature about capitalism, a wonderful book called History and Spirit, and another called The Age of Desire. All of these are essential works. And I remember having a conversation with him once in which he told me that he had just canceled his subscription to the New York Times. He said, "I can't take that much hegemony anymore." That's the New York Times. Okay, that's part of the capitalist international. There's also the International Monetary Fund, there's the World Bank, etc. The capitalist international is highly organized, but the workers' international and the international of communities are not organized. And I think, I'm a communitarian anarchist, and I believe very strongly that we're not going to get anywhere unless we transform our lives at the level of the grassroots community. But we're not going to escape collapse if we don't organize at the global level as citizens of the earth. As if we don't want to say the citizens of the Universal Republic, which wouldn't be a bad idea, we should think of ourselves as citizens of the earth. And we have to organize as citizens of the earth. I mean, one of the things I loved about working with the Papuans for 10 years is that every day the West Papua list gave me news about what was going on in the struggle in Papua. And this gave a different dimension to my life. These people became real people to me. Their struggles were real struggles. And I think we have to create those connections and have kind of a universal republic of caring.
How important are ideas in beginning that kind of process? I mean, I keep on thinking about this because, like, around here, and I think pretty much in most anywhere in the U.S., there's so many people who are struggling to do things like pay the exorbitant rents around here, this is the most rent-burdened city in the United States in terms of the how much people make compared to how much they pay in rent. But then at the same time, so many of these people who are struggling to come up with the rent, if they could afford to buy a house and then rent out, one of their apartments in a duplex or something to somebody else and make the kind of money that they are currently having to, come up with to pay they would do it. And it seems like this problem that, like in China, they called it the poor peasants and rich peasants, and that whole conflict. It seems like such a big part of the whole obstacle we face in the society is the rich peasants. I wonder if that's What you got to say about that?
Well,
Because it
there are at
seems
least
like
three
it's easier when,
questions that you just
there's
asked.
at
One is
least,
about ideas,
yeah,
and one is about the sort of pitting, really working class people against working class people.
yeah,
And there's a kind of implied question about, what can you do?
yeah. That's very good, Professor. Yeah,
uh, uh, well, I mean, the third about what we can do. I mean, the problem is that we're not doing what we can do. And I have this project out in the country, which I hope we can do a lot to start doing what we can do. But originally, I wanted to form a land trust community back 30 years ago. I didn't want to buy the land by myself. I wanted to create a community. At the time, it was 32 acres, and I wanted to I hope we could start that, and then it would spread to the surrounding area. We could have many families living out on the land. But one problem is that we don't have a lot of good examples of libertarian communitarian institutions. Obviously, we have this terrible hypocritical concept of the sharing economy, which ends up meaning new ways to exploit people. But we really don't have our sharing economy, the solidarity economy, the cooperative economy that we need. So one of the things that can come out of precarity and economic difficulty is that people can learn that we can do more collectively. Of course, we're then faced with the problem of not making that a new form of elitism. Élisée Reclus wrote about, he was a member of the cooperative movement, but as a revolutionary anarchist, broke with it because he said he saw too many examples in which people started out wanting to create a new world, and after 20 years they ended up being nothing more than a simple grocer, is the way he stated it. I think we have to remember that is a danger. So we have to learn. And I really admire Gustav Landauer, the great German communitarian anarchist thinker. I wish he were studied more. And he influenced Martin Buber, who inspired the early kibbutz when it was more radical. And he had the concept of the full cooperative. There's a cooperative of consumption, there's a cooperative of production, and there's a cooperative of living. And if you put the three together, you get what he called the full cooperative. And that's what we don't find enough of. A lot of these projects go wrong because they're just a worker cooperative or just a consumer cooperative or just cooperative housing. But if you have a cooperative community in which people are committed to the many-sided transformation of life and are working on themselves, they're working on their feelings, they're working on their imagination and so forth, then there's hope. So, I mean, that's the part of the third question. The second question is very specific and very difficult. New Orleans has had a terrible problem with Airbnbs and gentrification of the city and so forth, boutique city, et cetera. Post-Katrina, there was a big movement, ethnic cleansing, all of these things. But I think I don't like to generalize. I mean, what I really think is the great danger is that absentee owners are buying up property and just taking over neighborhoods and turning them into basically a commercial enterprise.
Right,
it's very collective on the part of the capitalist class. But on the other hand, you have a local, maybe a family that's been in New Orleans for generations, and they're having trouble making ends meet, and they rent out a couple of rooms in their house. I think that's a different sort of thing. It's not what I would like to see our community be in the future. But right now, I think we have to make those distinctions. And, it's the same way. I ride a bike mostly in the city. And I drive mostly because I spend part of the time in Mississippi. But, some people say everybody should ride a bike or everybody should do this, that, and the other thing. But then you have single mothers with a couple of kids, and you're going to tell them, who have two jobs, something like that. Oh, ride a bike, you save the world or something. I mean, I think we always have to think about the conditions of everybody's lives and not put all the burden on them when we're not creating the collective solutions that could help them. There's something from the 60s. The right wing came up with a slogan, which I thought was brilliant. This was in the Spiro Agnew days. What are you going to do when somebody's breaking into your house? Call a hippie? Okay. I mean, most people, like liberals, don't know what to do with this. Of course, anarchists do. It means we have to be responsible for our own self-defense. It was, I don't want guns. I don't want anything. But I'm going to call the police. That's what they're going to do. So it was an effective slogan for them. Yeah. But I think we have to always consider, what is the imaginary of that person? What is the ethos of that person? What is the ideology of that person? Where can we go from there? So that's kind of a partial answer to the second question. I'm forgetting what the first question of your three questions was.
Me too.
Ideas. It was like ideas.
Yeah, the power of the idea.
It was the enormous question.
It's really big, I know, but I mean, it's one I'm constantly. I constantly feel like I'm running across this, because if people can't imagine how society could be structured in such a way that it doesn't involve everybody struggling to come up with the basic expenses to feed themselves, house themselves, and pay for healthcare, society doesn't need to be that way. But I'm not sure how many people are even able to imagine how society could be any other way. And so it seems like the idea and the capacity to imagine these things, if that doesn't exist, then nothing else can happen.
Now I see what your question really is, and it's largely about the imagination, not just ideas in general, which could be ideology and so forth. One of the things I wrote in the book Impossible Community is the Sarvodaya movement in India and later in Sri Lanka. It was so-called Gandhian movement in India, and it's still alive in India. It's Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, there's the Sarvodaya Shramadana, which means, literally it meant the welfare of all. They call it the awakening of all, but Shramadana means the gift of work, the collective gift of work, working for the community. It's very similar to what you find in Chiapas. There's a concept that Dylan Fitzwater writes about, AMTEL, which in a sense means mutual aid. It means freely given help to our common needs to the community. But one of the things I like, and you can find this online also about the Gandhian movement. They had a very far-ranging program of, they had concepts like Swaraj, which means self-government, village Swaraj, village self-government, the village assembly, the village council, communalization of the land, Swadeshi, which was using our own products, producing locally or regionally. They had many wonderful concepts, but they also had the concept which they called the ashram, which many people think of as a religious community, but it doesn't mean that. It means a community of common practice. And they also had something called Sarvodaya worker. So the workers would be trained to work in every village of India. I mean, this is what we need to be working on. Do we have schools training people to be workers in every neighborhood and every town to help with this transformation process? If we're serious, this is what we need to do. This movement in India knew that, and we can learn from that. So one of the things that they thought was necessary is, and if I were going to translate ashram into contemporary English, I would say eco-village, because that's what it really was. It was a little village within each village or neighborhood in which people were living together, working together, producing ecologically, producing for real needs. And this is what I think would be wonderful. And I mean, they did train tens of thousands of people to do this work, and they set up a number of these communities. But this is what I think the ideal should be. Okay, so we believe in utopia in a sense. Everybody would say, well, we believe is utopian. I would call it topianism as much as utopianism, because the sense of place is so important. You can't do this abstractly. Utopia means a good place, but also no place. A topos is what we're concerned with. We are somewhere, and we need to. This is why bioregionalism is so important. We have to know where we are and be part of where we are, and it be an expression of where we are. But this is what I think the goal should be. The reason why people can't believe in utopia is because they can't walk to utopia from their own neighborhood. And what we need to do, this is putting a tremendous burden on us because we're not so good at it. We have to start creating communities that are so good that when people go there, they will want to be that way. They will want to live in that. This is what Gustav Landauer said in several of his books about communalism, that people have to develop a positive envy. He's like, envy's supposed
I feel
to be
like just like going to Denmark. I mean, I always feel that way every time I go to Denmark. But and it's not. I'm not sure if I'd describe Denmark as a utopia, but it's so much more of a utopia than.
Well, yeah, but I think we can do a little. I mean, I haven't been to Denmark in a long time. Maybe it's come a long way, but
No,
another thing Denmark isn't, by the way, is socialist.
Right.
Contrary, I mean, one of the strange things about the Sanders campaign is that whenever anybody asked him, what are you talking about? He said, well, it's like Denmark. Half of the time Denmark has a conservative government these days. Even I mean,
but half the people in Denmark
really
work for the government, and they have a very high standard of living, and you won't find much anything that's recognizable as poverty in terms of like what we see as you don't have tent cities in the center of Copenhagen. I mean, it's a totally different.
Well, obviously, that's one of the ways that we're controlled. That capitalism has to have some places that are so bad that we have to think that the best we can hope for is something like Denmark, which, by the way, we couldn't have because we would have a collapse of the world economy if everybody lived the way Denmark lives. Denmark is part of the global imperialist system. It benefits a lot from the suffering of other people around the world. So I'm more inspired by what peasants are doing in India than what rich people are doing in Denmark, really. And there's a wonderful TED Talk, by the way. There's a guy named Bunker Roy, who was a Gandhian. I hate to say Gandhian because then you give the name of a person to a movement, Sarvodaya, the welfare of all. He's in that tradition. And there is something called the Barefoot College that was started in India. And it's basically poor peasant women. It's like a 20-minute TED Talk. Bunker Roy is his name. If you need some inspiration, take a look at it and see what people from some of the poorest areas of India can do through mutual aid and using their own intelligence. And one of the great things in that video is that at the end you see video of some of the women from the poorest state of India going to Africa and working with very poor women in Africa to try to do some of the same self-help things that were developed at the Barefoot College in India. And I think we really don't give ourselves, meaning all of us, enough credit for what we're capable of doing.
On that note, John P. Clark, thank you so much for being our first guest on Fifth Estate Live, and we're going to have to...
Thank you. I'm very honored. I was really shocked to find out I would be the first person, and I've loved the Fifth Estate for so long that I'm really happy that this was possible, and I've also loved your music for so long, and have only seen you once in person. Hope to someday again.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we'll talk again in cyberspace, I suspect, before that happens.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John. See you again.
Bye.
And this has been our first edition of the Fifth Estate Live. We'll be back on Tuesday with another episode, and I will be also interviewing various folks Wednesday through Friday in the program I'm calling Discussions with David. Tomorrow I'll be talking with Ramsey Kanaan, founder of PM Press and part of the PM Press Collective, which is also the press that John P. Clark has his most recent book out on, and several other books as well. And look up the fifthestate.org is where you can find the online presence of the actual physical publication, which is a newspaper / magazine that has gone through various permutations, but has been around since 1965 and continues in physical form as well as online today. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. And all these, this and other interviews will all be archived if you look up discussions with David on my YouTube channel, or look up This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform. And you'll also find these on the Fifth Estate's Facebook page, and probably on the website eventually too, once we get that up. And thanks for tuning in, and keep on keeping on. Don't pay the rent. Mutual aid will get us through. Bye-bye.